History 322, Week 6. This is Audio 3. So I couldn't resist, this is slide 18 now, I couldn't resist throwing in just a few things so that you ever meet an Australian, you can avoid these small mistakes. That cute little animal with its baby on the right there is called a koala. It's not a koala bear, it's a koala. Qantas, the flag carrier airline of Australia, is not spelled with a U. The Sydney Harbour Bridge is pictured in that photograph there below the jet airplane. People used to climb it, that is, go on the arced part of the bridge there, illegally and when they were drunk, but since then, since about 10 years ago, the bridge has come under increasing control, and now the city milks tourists for for the privilege. It costs like $180, $190 to climb the bridge, but it takes a couple hours. It's a lot of fun. So if you ever go there, save your money and set aside some dollars to climb the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And finally, that line at the bottom is probably self-explanatory, but Kiwis generally don't like Aussies, and Aussies wonder why, sort of like we have it here in North America. Going on to slide 19. White Australia. Since Australia was to be kept white by popular demand, and Aboriginal people were not even included in the in the picture during this time, and that's another story that I'm not going to try to get into in this course of the weird things that white Australia did to the Aboriginal people. White Australia meant that Australia was isolating itself from Asia, quite purposely. Before 1901, there were six separate British colonies that were administered separately. And the idea of federation had begun in the late 1880s. It finally was realized in 1901. And Asians were only admitted for limited reasons, such as to harvest sugarcane. If you were to web search sugarcane, Australia, Asians, then you would come up with some interesting material about that. And so Australia was the closest ally of Britain, I think, until World War II. And then it became quite clear that Britain could not protect Australia when Darwin was bombed in February of 1942, and not just one aircraft straying away and dropping a bomb in the middle of a sugarcane field or something, Darwin again being in the far north. But a big raid was effected on Darwin that caused a lot of damage. After World War II, things changed. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the closest political and military relations remain with America, Britain, and Europe. I suppose in that order these days. Going on to slide 20. So the fact that Australian leaders determined that indeed the country could not defend itself by itself, and that the British were too far away to be useful in that regard, this caused the Australians to refocus their strategic calculations, and indeed the Americans were more than willing to oblige. However, this did not happen overnight, nor was it a very smooth process. MacArthur, that is General MacArthur, you remember him. He was the U.S. Forces commander in the Philippines. He had to leave when the Japanese came. He went to Brisbane, is where he made his capital, or his headquarters, I mean. And in came thousands of American soldiers, sailors, and Marines who who were brought to Australia in the same manner as they were brought to Britain during the occupation by the Nazis of the European mainland. So, with the Japanese threatening Australia and moving south at an ever-increasing pace, were American troops brought into Australia. And in the post-war era, there was one major problem. If you're interested in this sort of thing, you could web search the word Venona, which is spelled Venona. That's Victor Echo November Oscar November Alpha. Venona. You could web search the Venona project, which was run by the predecessor of the National Security Agency. It was a long project to decrypt, that is, to decode, Russian KGB telegrams that were going back and forth between New York and Moscow and between Washington, D.C. and Moscow, the KGB stations. And it was discovered in these very slowly, very agonizingly decrypted telegrams that Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were in the middle of a spy ring that was stealing atomic secrets and giving them to the Russians. And it was discovered also that in Australia there was a small problem like that too. Principally, it had to do with partly it had to do with somebody who was not purposely a Russian spy. He was the foreign minister, Dr. Evatt. Not to get into too many details, but he was running a very loose ship in the foreign office of the Australian government, and there was a spy ring in the Australian government. There were spy rings in the American government too, but we didn't cut off our own relations with ourselves. Never mind. So when this was discovered, the Americans withdrew intelligence cooperation in 1947, and it took 3 years to repair that. But eventually, when the so-called Liberal Party, which is really conservative, they continue to be around today. They just won the election in Australia, the Liberal Party. When the Liberal Party took power from Labour in 1950, they tightened everything up, and indeed, relations got better. In this photograph, we see happier days here. The Labour Prime Minister, Chifley, is at the White House with Harry Truman. Harry Truman, of course, who was vice president when Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away in April of 1944. Truman did not even know he was vice president of the United States, and he did not know about the Manhattan Project. That's how secret that was. So the Australians were concerned during the 1950s and into the 60s. They were concerned that there would be another Pacific War, and that Pacific War would spill over into northern Australia, like it almost did during World War II. There was a very anti-communist emphasis on this concern, which was not unjustified. I think if you take a close look at history and you try to be objective about it, there certainly was an expansion going on in Asia by the countries that by China, which was trying to assist its brother fraternal party in Indochina to take over there. China was sponsoring the communist insurgency in Malaya. China was sponsoring the PKI, which wasn't founded by China, but which was funded by China after about 1955. So there was a genuine concern, which was based on data, that the Chinese were trying to expand their power through Asia, and that's not something. As you can imagine from that previous slide with Mrs. Australia there and John Chinaman, as you can imagine, there was not very much joy in Canberra or anywhere else in Australia about that idea. As well, this is when, in the early 50s, this is when the so-called Five Eyes intelligence relationship began. And Five Eyes basically means these five countries, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they share everything. And I mean everything. And this is a not only a close intelligence relationship, but it's a very close political relationship, and it has had historical impact that you should keep in mind, because it means that the English-speaking, these are obviously the English-speaking countries, it means that the English-speaking countries are closely allied with each other, and that's probably not going to change anytime in the foreseeable future. Going on to slide 21. So in 1945, as you can see in this, I think, very well done documentary that I've posted on D2L, in 1945, the new minister for immigration, named Caldwell, had reached an agreement on a plan with Prime Minister Chifley. This is the Labour government now, and they reached this idea that they wanted to triple the population of Australia, take it from 7 million up to 21 million in some undetermined amount of time. That took decades. It wasn't until 2008 that there were 21 million people in Australia, and which proves how difficult it was. So the first thing they tried to do, that was being done before World War II, was the first thing that was tried was to increase the amount of British people in Australia, as you could see from that earlier slide. But then, coming to the conclusion that Australia would never be able to defend itself or industrialize if it did not have more people, they decided to pursue Eastern European refugees, people from the Baltic countries. And what am I talking about? Lithuanians, some Russians, Estonians. These were people who, not discounting the Russians for a second, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, these were people who were taken over by the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution, and didn't necessarily want to go back home. They were stateless refugees. They were called displaced persons, or DPs, by the United Nations. And so the Australians went after them, as you can learn more about that in the video. Going on to slide 22. So that brought the population of Australia up a little bit through the late 1940s, and at the same time, the Australians were trying to get rid of these roughly 6,000 Asian people who had moved to Australia as refugees from the war against Japan. But not all of them wanted to go. Not that many of them wanted to go. They had set up businesses. They had married Australians. They'd had children, and so on. But the government was fairly determined to deport them, based entirely on race. So this case, very interesting case of Annie OKeefe, formerly Annie Jacob, who had fled the Netherlands and East Indies with her husband Samuel, who later died on an intelligence mission in 1944. They arrived in Australia in 1942, and the landlord that they had, Samuel Jacob, had talked to Jack OKeefe, his landlord, a retired postal worker, and asked him to take care of the family if anything ever happened to him, which it did. So there was, when the government began to deport people, the Jacobs there were 8 children in that family. The Jacobs were put on the list to go, and there was a legal challenge, and eventually the High Court heard this case and ruled against the government. And when they ruled against the government and said that the O'Keefe family should be allowed to stay, the immigration minister, Caldwell, he said that the pillar of the White Australia policy has been demolished. He could see, as this video says, he could see the handwriting on the wall. And at this point, there was a very strong public reaction to this case. Most of the people who wrote to the Immigration Department and to the Prime Minister wrote to object, to say that Australians were not acting in an Australian way. They were not being hospitable, they were not being kind, they were not being humane by deporting this family and others like it. And this was the first step in Australia sort of waking up to find itself in Asia with Asians as neighbors. Going on to slide 23. So you can, I'm not going to go through this bit by bit because I think I ought to wind this up, but you can see the data here, that there were only 7.7 million people in 1949 populating Australia, and they went through some phases of bringing in the so-called beautiful adults, of instituting a 75% European appearance rule that lasted for about 10 years, of going through and over the course of about 7 years, up to February 1954, bringing in, or 8 years, bringing in 1 million migrants. Only a small proportion of those, however, were Asian until 1975. And I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but there's a part 2 of that video is in, I think, week 9 in D2L, so you can see that part 2 depending on your level of interest. Again, all videos are optional. So that target that Ben Chifley had, the Prime Minister, the Labour Prime Minister, had in 1946 of 21 million people was only met in, I was wrong, not 2008, it was met in 2007. And in the last 10 years, if you average it out, the majority of immigrants have been from Asia and not Europe. Absolutely true since 2007. And now the population is at 23 million. It's interesting to note, as the video does, that even when the Liberal Party, the Liberal Country Coalition, was elected in 1949, in December of 1949, part of the reason that they were elected was a bit of a white backlash against some of this Asian immigration stuff and the beautiful adults and all that. However, just like the Labour Party made a secret decision to go against popular sentiment in pushing for more immigration because they could see that it was needed for national survival, so the Liberal Country Party coalition, really conservatives, looked at the situation, looked at the data, and decided to just leave everything alone. They didn't change or reverse any of this immigration policy instituted by Labour. Over time, however, as this slide makes clear, that changed eventually so that more Asians were entering Australia. And now, Australia, I don't think it's really there yet, but it's becoming a multicultural society. And this has had great historical, at least in my opinion, great historical consequence for the history of Asia, because it means that all of a sudden there is this country that has become more of a part of Asia. It's a big place. It doesn't have that many people, but it's big. And it's a very close American ally. Naturally, this has significant implications for the balance of power, for public perceptions of what is Asian and what is not, and for the involvement of the United States in Asia. Going on to slide 24. So Australia has has had these. I've already covered part of the slide. There have been changes, but there have also been continuities. Indonesians, and when the Australian Armed Forces go through their scenarios for wars they might get into, sad to say, Indonesia is at the top of the list of potential adversaries. And that reality is reflected in the way the immigration system has handled Indonesians. They don't let too many of them in. That's just the way it is. They welcome Chinese and Indian-born people much more readily than they do Indonesians. And if you want to go online and look at the statistics there, all you have to do is web search the obvious words. Immigration, Australia, Indonesian, Chinese, Indian, and you'll find the data. And the strong political and military ties and intelligence ties with the US, UK, Canada, and New Zealand continue. At the same time, as this chart shows, the ratio of Australian exports, which kept Australia out of the economic downturn, have gone sharply up in the direction of China. I don't have to speak to this chart. You can see it before your very eyes. It is Chinese purchases of mined commodities like coal and uranium and bauxite that have fueled the Australian economy in great percentage over the past 10 years. They've been kept out of the worldwide economic downturn, and it resulted, the Australian dollar is worth a little bit less than $1 US now, but there were times over the past 10 years when the Australian dollar was worth more than $1 US. So there you go. So having discussed these changes that have occurred during World War II and in the immediate post-war era over Southeast Asia, we will turn next to the Cold War. Have a great weekend.